Come on into the Man Cave. Lots to get to tonight, including the breaking news is that apparently Susan Lee and the Libs are right on the verge of trying to find a way to jump out of the net zero commitments that this government is committed to. Does it help? Does it hurt? We'll discuss it all with the man who forced the hand in many ways of the Nationals, and that is the great Matt Canavan. He is here and will be with us a little later tonight. The Prime Minister, well, back in question time after floating around the world, indignant as always, but I got some more details about how secret this government is. Of course, much different than what they promised to be and how they do it. And wait till I show you some of the numbers that tell you about which Australian state has not been doing the hazard reduction required ahead of what is probably going to be yet another big bushfire season. Why? Because that's what always happens in summer. Now, as you've heard today, there was a big moment when a whole bunch of senators were full of huff and puff and wanted to blow the Optus house down, finger-waving and all. A perfect example is this Green who doesn't know the difference between legal and illegal, apparently.
Optus clearly don't think they have to inform you of serious outages or the numbers the numbers don't matter, and they obviously didn't think that they have an illegal obligation to inform you of whether there's a deadly result. And doesn't that say something about how they view you as a regulator? And they clearly don't take you seriously.
Senator, that's a question you have to put up to Optus.
Okay, yes, she misspoke, but this, of course, is the person who has form like Sea Patrol. Remember that one from way back when she was talking about the Australian Navy and Sea Patrol? Of course, that was the fictitious show about the Navy that I think was back on Channel 9 way back when. Now, this is the facts, okay? This is what we know about all of that hullabaloo, all of that carry-on. And again, I'm not at all holding water for Optus, but today it went too far when the people who, yes, technically have regulation over the telecommunications industry tried to pretend that they had control over a private company. The outage, which took place in September, lasted for 13 hours. 600 calls in a country of 27 million were affected. Optus, and this is sort of the arse covering of corporate culture these days, they sent an email trying to inform the government, but it was the wrong address. So it was the next day when they sent it to a different part of the government when the government was fully aware of what was going on. Now, why did that take place? Why is that such an important part of this story? Because despite the huff, despite the puff, Optus today in its evidence said that by law they didn't have to do what they did badly the first time, but correctly the second time, which was to get in touch with the government in real time while they were trying to fix the problem. Again, here's evidence before the parliamentary committee.
The obligation we had on the 18th was to inform the ACMA and as I said, the ECP of the fact that there had been a network outage, and we did that. Because we did that, we also made sure which is not required by regulation, but we made sure that we informed the department and the minister's office as well.
So is there potentially a need for a rule change, a change in legislation to make sure that the second something goes down, somebody is automatically aware in the regulator and then the minister's office? Probably. But again, people waving their fingers as if that law exists when, again, according to the evidence of Optus, that law does not exist. What did exist on that day was that the Communications Minister, Annika Wells, had failed to deliver on a promise that the government said they would do way back as 2024. Now, they said that they were going to have a special person who would be inside each of the telecommunications companies, essentially to be the human being who would be aware that if something went wrong, they would either inform the relevant people or maybe part of fixing it. Well, this government sat on what was called the 000 safeguard for more than a year. They only backfilled it once their failures had been exposed. It was not a priority of the previous communications minister. It was not a priority of this communications minister after becoming the minister many, many months before September. We also know some of the behind the scenes about what went wrong. Now, in the same way that there are energy companies that essentially are a shopfront that will sell you electricity. They'll buy it from somebody else. They don't make the electricity. Optus is not in control, or wasn't in direct control, of many of the network towers. Other people had that responsibility. And in this case, it was the Finnish technology company, Nokia. Now, while Nokia phones are nowhere near as cool as they used to be, and certainly not as popular as they used to be, the company Nokia is still well and truly involved in the telecommunications world, i.e. controlling many of the towers and some of the towers that went down, producing that problem for 13 hours, affecting 600 people who called 000. Again, the facts. The reason I open the show with this tonight is so that you can know at the end of all of this up and down, all of the yelling, all of the finger pointing, what went wrong. Will people be held responsible for it inside Optus? Well, some people have already decided they'll be leaving the company soon. Whether that is of their choice or not, well, of course, we'll never know. This interrelationship with Nokia seems to have been a very significant part about how the towers fell down and who knew what and when, because Optus outsourced the operations of its mobile phone networks to Nokia in 2018, scrapping the 170 jobs the Finnish company took over from centres in Chennai, India and in Sydney. Before Nokia started the firewall upgrade that related to the September 18 outage, it identified network changes associated with the upgrades as, quote, zero risk. So Optus is claiming that the company they rely upon for part of its network to stay up, Nokia, told them, we're going to update the software. Don't worry, zero risk, no calls will be interrupted. Obviously, that is not what took place. But now that you know that the law does not mean that the second there is a problem with Optus, Telstra or Vodafone's network, that it is no one's job or responsibility to jump for a bat phone that wakes the minister up in the middle of the night as if there was a nuclear missile that had been fired towards Australia. Now that you know that the extent of the outage was 13 hours, now that you know that there is somebody else who had the responsibility for the tech working, and there was clearly an issue of them not being able to deliver on their central issue, and yes, on some parts that's blame shifting, but this is all part of the story, right? Compare the carry-on of the politicians who made it seem like the CEO of Optus got up in the middle of the night and was, with a pair of bolt cutters, cutting the wires to kill access to the 000 system. Now, this is American-style politics. We keep being told that Australia doesn't want American-style politics. Well, this is American-style politics. When politicians want to show off to voters and the media rather than actually fix the problem. Because if the problem here is the law, they don't need an inquiry to work that out. The inquiry was essentially a show trial. A show trial of a company of which I do not carry water for, of which must be held morally and in any other sense responsible for its own failures, including its interrelationship with other companies like Nokia. But this is American politics at its worst, which is to make it look like we're doing something, we yell at someone and then don't do anything. This is some of the back and forth that was in the inquiry today, including from Senator Hyphen.
Surely you have an obligation to inform the regulator and the government as soon as you know that the information you had previously given them was wrong, grossly inadequate, wrong, so wrong that it actually has led and is linked to people's death.
I've reached out to the families. To the
No, that's not my question, Mr. Rowe. Please do not duck and weave. What I've asked, have they indicated that they wish to meet with you? Has there been any other communication directly from the families to you or anyone else at Optus?
I'm giving you a direct answer, and that is that the privacy of the families.
It's not a direct
that is not acceptable.
It took you 24 hours almost to correct the record. I don't see, it doesn't matter how much you spin this, Mr. Rowe, you left a false understanding and false information in the hands of the regulators for almost 24 hours.
Now, these are the people who sit on the Communications Committee. In some way, they would think that they have some level of regulation over every platform you read, see and hear. And that's true because to some degree they inform the decisions of the Parliament makes its laws. But they also know that the actual technical difficulty that knocked out the system for 13 hours and failed 600 people, 3 of which are no longer with us, is utterly irrelevant about what the government knew and when it knew. The failure is the problem, not who was told about the failure. The who was told about the failure is the excuse for the show trial that we got today. Now, I've taken a bit of time to go through and show you the facts. How much of that do you reckon turned up at 6 p.m. tonight versus let's get 'em?
The telco revealing the timeline today in a 2.5-hour Senate grilling.
A shocking litany of failures was laid bare today as Optus executives faced the fury of senators.
The telco's evidence during a Senate grilling today.
Now, why do I take such time to talk about what feels like a kind of old thing from a few weeks ago? Because the very same people who were huffing and puffing and waving their fingers today, including Senator Hanson-Young, representing the Greens, the Minister representing the Labor Party with all of the carry-on and that she's been doing inside the Parliament, is because there was another thing that happened today when it came to the Senate and inquiries. The Labor Party got together with the Greens in the Senate to vote down an inquiry into the CFMEU. Now, the situation with Optus is very serious, and I, again, want everyone to be held accountable. But what do you think is an ongoing and rolling problem for the country? 13 hours at Optus, or the way the CFMEU has been alleged to have been behaving for a little more than 13 months, a little more than 13 years, dare one say. Senator Jane Hume, representing the Liberals, she was the one pushing for this inquiry.
In what world is it reasonable to refuse an inquiry into a union that's been infiltrated by organised crime, that's riddled with corruption and is now shielded by a government that simply will not act?
And why should there not be one? Why did Labor and the Greens block one, while simultaneously the inquiry into Optus was headline news everywhere? Well, our mate Tony Sheldon was just loyal to the movement.
This motion is an ideological absolute farce. What they're doing across the way is really just trying to find a way to unite themselves when they're so disunited.
The obvious other news is around the Nationals and their decision when it comes to net zero. As you know, our mate Matt Canavan, who has been saying it for years, has been refining his argument for months, was able to lead the charge to convince the remainder of the National Party, that's it, we're out. Now, very importantly, and I mentioned this in some detail last night, but I get it, Sunday night, cricket, other things may well mean that you weren't in the front row, and that's okay. You need a note, but still. The National Party is not saying climate change does not exist and we don't need to do anything about it. So anyone who thinks that that's what has happened and that is where the end of the rainbow is going to be for the coalition, pay attention to what the Nationals are saying. They don't believe in the hard and fast rules of net zero by 2050. They don't believe in the hard and fast rules about 2035, but they also don't believe in doing bugger all.
We're not walking away from reducing emissions. We continue to believe that we need to reduce emissions, but we've got to do it in a better, fairer, cheaper way for all Australians. And what we are going to say is that we believe that we can peg ourselves to the rest of the world. We're not going to be a laggard, but we're not going to streak ahead.
Now, things being the way that they are, is that if the coalition breaks, and it will break if the Liberal Party does not adopt the similar, if not exact, position as the National Party, is that the National Party will be running against the Liberal Party, potentially, in every seat in the country. And while, yes, they'll end up preferencing each other, meaning essentially the vote will still coalesce, they'll still be running against each other. They'll still be campaigning against each other. It'll be sort of an internal fight amongst themselves to fight for who is on top in the opposition while, of course, the government, that being Labor, will be able to dance off scot-free. But that may be what many people want. Hence why the pressure is now on the Libs and on Susan Ley particularly to join the Nationals and still believe in climate change, still believe in doing something, but walk away from the slogan that is net zero.
The party's decision to ditch its commitment to the policy has put renewed pressure on Liberal leader Susan Ley.
Really does put incredible pressure on the leader of the opposition.
This move by the National Party has raised plenty of questions on how the Liberal Party will now respond.
Now again, Matt Canavan on the show, always joins us on a Monday. I'm so pleased that he is here. He'll be cock-a-hoop, either on the Nationals, going their own way, but certainly now that there is a clear decision that they will be nowhere near net zero. What does he think also about how they implement what the leader had to say today about recognising that there is a problem and doing something about it, but not doing something at the speed the Labor Party currently is? That's worth talking about. I've also heard a couple of people, and this, I'll be honest, was more something I heard on the radio than something I've heard on television, but I've constantly heard about this thing that net zero is a vote loser. Now again, I don't understand the logic with this. People don't vote for the coalition and therefore vote for Labor because Labor is more committed to the net zero timelines. It doesn't make sense. If it's a loser of votes on the right, fine and fair enough. But the very sad reality here, as somebody who does not like the current government, would have preferred them to have their wings clipped rather than grown another metre at the election, is that despite the fact that Pauline Hanson's One Nation is surging, no doubt about it, highest numbers they've ever got, Libs, lowest numbers they've ever got, in part because of the fight in and around this. You need to know that the overall left-wing pile in Australia has grown since the last federal election. The federal election was 55-45. The Libs have lost 2, Labor, Greens, Teals, all the rest has grown by 2. So again, it is not my position. I am not a participant. I am simply an observer, somebody who's seen the ups, the downs, the highs, the lows, the logic and the lack of it in this conversation. A person who knows that Australia is 1% of the world's problem, but the world has a problem, right? But also understands that of the climate clock, 45 minutes of the climate clock is either bigger problems or doing less than we are, meaning we're not going to be able to change the climate with the current levels of Australian action, or even if every teal and green dream came true. What I think is potentially very important for wherever the coalition lands, and most likely it is going to land where the Nationals have already taken it, where I know so many people watching this program want it to go, which is no to net zero, is that obviously, with that left-wing pile growing, you have to say what the Nats said before. They're not talking about climate change doesn't exist. They're saying emissions still need to be cut. This is something that One Nation has jumped very hard into, and that in part is going to be what they're going to continue to campaign against when it comes to the Nationals and when it comes to the Liberals. But my belief is that you need to come up with what you are going to do at the same time as you say what you're not going to do. Otherwise, you end up in this conversation around slogans. You end up in a vacuum. You end up in a scenario where your opponents are able to make up what you are going to do. So again, do I have the answer that politically unlocks the bike chain that gets us to a place of this government being under more pressure? No. But I think that this is an opportunity for the opposition sooner rather than later to tell us what they want to do. Because very obviously a majority of Australians believe there is a problem and it needs to be dealt with. So what's your solution? Maybe they could say, we're going to plant 1 billion trees. Some environmental experts have said that's the answer because, look, we can't solve the world, but we can suck a lot of the crap out of the sky and maybe that takes us closer to net zero. Maybe the opposition could win some of the seats that are affected by floods, fires and bushfires, regardless of whether they're the biggest or worst ever or all the rest, because the reality is insurance costs more than it ever has in Australia, in part because of the payouts that come as a result of things like fire and flood. I'm not talking about climate change. I'm talking about a different way of dealing with a problem that could unlock some people thinking about voting National or Liberal. What about coming up with some sort of a standing paid or volunteer army that means our response to natural disasters is even more professional? The idea that the wonderful people of the SES take as much time off from their jobs, surely some people should be paid to be part of a standing service to deal with this stuff, because it means that we get it, that Australia, as 1% of the world's problem, will be affected by the lack of action of India, Russia, currently the United States, the third world, and the pollution that comes from China. So this could be a way of saying, so how are you going to deal with climate change? Well, this is how we're going to deal with climate change. Maybe it's a scenario where part of our foreign aid that is given to Pacific Island nations or third world countries, that part of it again is about money and help, and probably more so help than money, to plant as many trees as possible again, to suck stuff out of the sky. Because you have to be in a position where, whether we like it or not, in 2025, when somebody says, so what are you going to do about climate change, what's your answer? Because every piece of electoral evidence that I have seen of every poll of every company says that we are way past the concept of does it exist or not. And future voters have greater intensity, and that by I mean younger voters, have deeper intensity about are you going to do something about climate change? And unless you have some of the options of how you are going to engage with this issue, well, then the Labor Party is just going to turn around and say, well, they don't believe in net zero, which means they don't believe in climate change. Now, we've seen how this BS works. We've seen it with Medicare, that even though there was no policy anywhere to cut Medicare, the Labor Party lied and 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 got a record result. The media let them lie and lie and lie and lie and lie, and they got a record result. So as well as choosing not to go down the path that is very difficult and at times destructive for our country, that is all of the rules Bowen's put in place, all of the laws that they have passed, there has to be that fundamental answer. What are you going to do? Because every day that you step away from the slogan but don't have a solution is a vacuum in which Labor and the media will fill with lies. Now, as we know, this government loves playing things in secret. They love treating the Australian population like mushrooms, keep them in the dark and feed them. And in particular, this is when it comes to documents, the redacted documents situation that I have talked about in some detail, and I'm going to keep talking about it because this is our system. This matters. If we can't see what the government knows, then the government will get away with doing bad things. I am also so pleased that there are many other parts of the media that are starting to notice and use the platforms they have to comment on these issues. In the Sydney Morning Herald, which has done some great reporting on this, the Albanese government came to power promising the world a commitment to transparency, respect for Parliament, checks and balances, but it's gridlocked by arrogance. Even veterans like Michelle Grattan, writing for The Conversation, republished by the ABC, meaning this issue is starting to be seen inside the places that are normally endlessly positive for the government. Albanese government has not walked its talk about accountability and integrity. Michelle Grattan says, observers believe Anthony Albanese is the main driver of limiting information. The inclination to secrecy is part of the government's disappointing record more generally on integrity issues, highlighted in the past week by the Centre for Public Integrity and the report that they did. Remember, I showed you this report in chapter and verse last week that shows everything from jobs for the boys, freedom of information, and a whole bunch of other things are worse under this government, when they, of course, promised to be so different. Meantime, that very report that I just showed you, the Albanese government's integrity report card, it showed poor results on various fronts. And our Canberra team too, independent of anything that we've been saying on air here, and I'm not the type of person who's ringing people behind the scenes, we should cover this, we shouldn't, that's not my power. All I control editorially is the hour of real estate that we have here each and every night. That's it. I'm not one of those people. Secrecy over sunlight. Anthony Albanese running his own cult of secrecy 3 years after lashing Morrison government's culture of cover-up. This was a story written by my friend and colleague Trudy McIntosh in our Canberra Bureau, where she points out, again, the government is trying to put new laws in place to make it harder to see what it is doing, make it harder to get freedom of information requests to know what is behind those blacked out pieces of paper. It is also failing to deal with a report that it's had for now 2 years about jobs for the boys and how to stop it. Geez, I wonder why. She also throws in the Prime Minister and his vagueness around the ISIS brides. On the ISIS brides repatriation in October, the Prime Minister avoided giving a straight answer on whether the group of women and children would be returned to the camp from Syria. The political fight centred on whether the government had technically provided assistance. Sure, no assistance was provided in terms of the repatriation flights, as had been the case previously, but when the group returned to Australia, it seemed like Mr Albanese hadn't been completely up front. And again, if you missed the show last night, I want to bring back a highlight that remember those redacted documents, and the Senate was trying to force them to be unredacted. Chris Bowen gave them the middle finger and told them to go jump. Because, quote, unless ministers can be assured of the confidentiality of cabinet meetings, they may not speak frequently or honestly between themselves and more likely to suppress the views on present policies that may be unpopular or politically embarrassing. His justification for why you can't know what he knows about the consequences of his policies is because they may be unpopular or politically embarrassing. Can you believe that? Now, this week is also going to be a very big week for politics in the United States. Now, we are Wednesday. It's going to be 12 months since Trump was elected. That's fast, right? It means it was a year ago since we were standing, of course, on the balconies there and getting across things in Washington. Can you believe it's a year? Anyway, there's going to be, as always, the first Tuesday in November, which is Wednesday in Australia, a whole bunch of elections that are going to be around. And of course, is it a litmus test about whether Trump is popular or not? Later in the week, I will show you all of the data that says whether he's up or down. Now, you may see a lot of videos that the Democrats are hopeless and they're sort of bumping into walls and they can't open a drawer. Well, not everything's amazing for Trump at the moment when it comes to the polls, but of course, he is utterly dominant in American politics. But the biggest election that will be taking place this week in the United States is which direction the great city of New York City will be going. Now, it's always a blue city, but how blue is it going to go? Well, blue and almost red, because as you know, Zoran Mandani is the Democrat socialist who believes in a whole bunch of, quote unquote, free stuff for everyone, sending counsellors rather than cops, you know, all of that garbage. Anyway, Trump was asked about him on America's version of 60 Minutes, and I wanted to show this to you tonight.
Zoran Mandani, 34-year-old Democratic socialist. He's the
communist, not socialist, communist. He's far worse than a socialist.
Some people have compared him to a left-wing version of you, charismatic, breaking the old rules. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I'm a much better looking person than him.
Okay, that's it.